Welcome, everyone, and from all over the world. It's just wonderful to see this from Northern Ireland as well. I can see Lisburn, from Liverpool, Brisbane. They keep coming up. Do have a look in the webinar chat. So, welcome to this Curious Conversations. Today, we have the great pleasure to hear from Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener. Now, many of you will know Robert already. He's an inspiring speaker. His passion is about bringing science into positive psychology and coaching. He's known as the Indiana Jones of positive psychology I think for a number of reasons. One is because he looks adventurous, and he is adventurous, but also because he's done research all over the world on many of the topics we're interested in: happiness, courage, amongst many other topics. You know, Robert is a leading figure in the field of positive psychology and in the field of coaching psychology. So we're incredibly grateful to have this chance to hear from Robert. He's published many books, written many articles. But I just want to say something personal, Robert, before we start, which is I'm just grateful that during this pandemic, we've had a chance to build our relationship, and for me to consider Robert as a friend. He's he's got an incisive intellect. He's funny and playful. He's inspired me more than anyone else in the field of integrating coaching and positive psychology. He's a wonderful friend, but I would also consider you my teacher, Robert, which is why I just love the opportunity for us to talk like this. So welcome, Robert, and thank you for giving us your time today.
Yeah, that's very touching, Christian. I appreciate that. I actually didn't know that you felt like that. So thank you so much. Gosh.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Definitely. There's been so much learning in every conversation, and I think it's going to be the same now. So listeners and viewers, whether live or recorded, you're in for a treat. I know that. Please feel free to continue using the chat while we're talking. I'd like this to feel like it's Robert and I having a chat, but with a chance for you to be commenting on what's going on. If you have any specific questions for Robert, please put them in the Q&A box, which will allow me to bring them in if it kind of fits into the flow of the conversation. So, Robert, here we are. First question, thinking about the science of positive psychology, which I would say itself has been flourishing over the last 2 decades, how can our viewers and listeners who are in the main educators and educational leaders, how can they integrate some of the science of positive psychology into their professional roles?
Okay. You certainly don't start small. Just how can an entire body of science be used to inform an entire profession? I love it. Look, there's not going to be a singular answer to this. I'm going to give you lots of different ways to think about it, with the caveat that I don't know if I'm right. So if there's something that you disagree with, I'm not here to convert you. Take what's useful to you and leave what is not. So let's just start with, I assume that many, maybe even most people here have some background in positive psychology. You at the very least know what it is. You've probably read some blog posts or popular books, if not taken a course, read an academic article, pursued an advanced degree, or what have you. I think the cool thing about positive psychology is it's just so easy to like. Topics like well-being, motivation, curiosity, creativity, humor, playfulness, they speak to us in a very human way. We all have some ownership of them. And the cool thing is I think positive psychology is a lot broader and a lot bigger than I think many other people believe. So there sort of becomes this, let's call it standard fare of positive psychology. For people who are novitiates into the positive psychology science, they're like, oh yeah, I've read about happiness, optimism, grit, mindset, right? Especially as educators, those are going to be 2 topics that jump out to you. But it's easy to rush to closure on those, I think, without thinking, I wonder what other positive topics there are that there's research on. So what about a topic like taking initiative? That's a positive psychology topic. Or connoisseurship, having expertise in an area such that you can appreciate it with an extreme degree of sophistication, right? Connoisseurship, craftsmanship, wisdom, hospitality. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. Cooperation, friendship. And so whatever it is you already know, I would encourage you to feel empowered to pursue other topics, because there's large bodies of research that are out there that are not being reported on as commonly in sort of the hallways of positive psych. So that's just my lead in. Can I keep going? Do you mind, Christian?
Yes, please. We'd love to hear. But it's an excellent lead in. And, you know, what I'm thinking is positive psychology is actually, you know, it's called the science of optimal functioning or optimal well-being. And that must be relevant to us as educators. But thank you. Please do go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I train people in positive psychology, and I just ask, you know, write down as many topics as you can in positive psychology. The lists I get are pretty similar to one another, which isn't bad, right? You know, strengths, hope, happiness. But people tend not to write about doing each other favors. I've never seen doing favors on the list. Reconciliation, right? Not do you forgive someone, but how after a fight do you reconnect? Reconciliation, like those should all be on the list. And there are literally dozens upon dozens of these topics that do have a research literature. And unlike maybe, you know, the properties of light refraction, or, you know, something very specific about physics, or the study of mushrooms, you know, that you know, just might seem like arcane science, this is just psychology. It's something that we have an innate intuitive understanding of, right? So I think if I say reconciliation, you're like, oh, I have some experience with that. I think if I read a chapter on that topic, it would make sense to me. It wouldn't be beyond me. So I would just hope that everyone here feels empowered to look up things on ResearchGator or Google Scholar, or, you know, some of these places where academic research or chapters are made available to you, and go ahead and follow your own unique leanings. So when you do this and you know something about positive psychology, how does it inform things like education? Well, I think there's sort of three broad ways. One is assessment. One of the things that psychologists do well is we create assessments. You find this in educational psychology, and you're already familiar with assessment, whether it's NAPLAN or a quiz you give at the end of the week. You're going to be familiar with assessing knowledge, assessing learning, assessing, in fact, these sort of abstract things. Well, psychologists have done this for more than 100 years. We can assess intelligence, we can assess attention, we can assess quality of life, flourishing, all sorts of things. So I think taking assessments and using them to create baseline measures, using assessments to track progress, using assessments to provide us with a vocabulary for better articulating things, using assessment for better understanding ourselves, I think is a great place to start. I also think the frameworks that researchers use are particularly helpful. So I think that expertise is great because it provides a specific vocabulary that then helps us think things through with a greater degree of nuance. So if you just think there's one thing, for example, called motivation, and your students have it or they don't, that's pretty unsophisticated, right? Motivation is not just a light switch that you just click on and off. It's more like a dimmer switch that you turn up and down. But what if each one of those points along that continuum of motivation has its own label? What if it goes from a motivation to extrinsic motivation to introjected motivation to identified motivation to intrinsic motivation? And suddenly I've got 5 or 6 terms by which I can sort of categorize types of motivation that become increasingly more inborn, more intrinsic. And just having that helps me understand my students better, helps me understand what am I looking at? What is this person responding to? Is this the kind of person that needs a deadline because they need a little bit of external pressure? Or is this someone that doesn't, that's just going to do it because they just are burning with passion from the inside? And one is not right and the other wrong. It's just about understanding and using this framework to understand things. So I'm going to come up for air in just a second, Christian. I will say this, that people are taught frameworks, and I think the vagaries of this, the real potential hindrance is to learn a framework, let's say PERMA, which I'm guessing many people here might know, and then thinking that that's the truth and that that's sort of the hammer that we need to hit every single person with, as if everyone is a nail of, equal stature. And PERMA is useful. I'm not coming at this with an anti-PERMA approach to well-being, but understand that PERMA is one of a dozen approaches to well-being that you could potentially use. And once you have a framework, it just gives you a common vocabulary for having discussions and understand things, whether that's with your colleagues, with your students, or just within yourself. So I just said a ton of stuff. I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And it's such wonderful things to think about. And I love the idea of, one thing is for us to use positive psychology assessment tools, and it's things we can use with ourselves as educators. Leaders can use it with their teams. Educators can use it with students. So I love that aspect of things. And there's a lot of stuff out there for free, isn't there? So there's that angle. And I also love the idea of finding theories. And again, your example of motivation, the applications are endless, aren't they? Just, you've picked one example, but I'm thinking for, educators and leaders themselves to kind of think, well, where am I on that? I love the dial idea. It's not I'm motivated or not, but what is my motivation? Where is it? But also when we're talking to even to colleagues, and, I wonder how motivated they are and what can I do to increase their motivation. So I love the idea of using theories, but not holding too fast to them. And I love the idea of using existing assessments like strengths. But as you mentioned, strengths and strengths use is getting more adopted in many educational contexts. Do you want to say something more about how educators or leaders can just bring strengths use into their everyday practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think there's great utility in focusing on strengths. Like everything in positive psychology, I don't think it needs to be an exclusive focus on strengths. It doesn't mean, of course, that we're going to ignore weaknesses or areas of deficiency, or just, relabel them, areas of development or growth, because the truth is, I think your strengths are your areas of development or growth. And certainly there's some research suggesting that we make great gains in developing our strengths, in part because we're more passionate about them, they're more energizing, we're more motivated. I personally am pretty unmotivated to change my weaknesses because I'm not all that interested in them. What I tend to do is just avoid the situations that would bring my weaknesses to play. And instead, I double down on the things that I already have some potential in, and I find that I make good gains there. Interestingly, Carol Dweck, who I'm sure people will know from mindset research, has a study out maybe 3-4 years ago now, where she talked about finding a passion versus developing a passion, right? And that finding a passion is this very fixed mindset idea that like you're just going to walk around until you stumble over this thing, like, oh, look, there it is, it's violin or whatever. But really, you cultivate it. And it starts with, I am kind of interested in music, but I sort of hate the piano. Oh, but I find that stringed instruments just really speak to me. I played the cello for a while, and then that sort of morphs into the violin, and eventually you have evolved into it. And just taking that approach, I think, is quite nice with strengths, which is once we have an understanding of strengths, thinking, okay, let's use them, and not just use them in a new way, but just understanding how you can use them more effectively. What's the right amount to use this? Who reacts well to my strength? So, let's say I have a strength of humor, and I noticed that some people on the faculty at my school don't love it. I should actually probably take my foot off the gas pedal where my humor is concerned in meetings where those people are. And maybe I can use it to better effect with the people who I am aware respond really well to it. So it's about using my strengths smarter, not just more. And I do think there are concentric circles. I think you start with yourself. Now, I know educators are so mission driven, and I've worked with educators in Canada and the US, Australia. I have seen educators say, I love talking about strengths. How can I use it with my students? And I always say, put on the brakes. See if you can use it with yourself first, your colleagues second, students third. And I think it's really important for you to have your own strength vocabulary, understand your own relationship to your strengths, try and work on your strengths, see what you notice about that process before trying to do any kind of strength intervention or understand your clients or your colleagues rather through their strengths. And once you have done that, then I think you're ready to, build it into your curriculum, start doing it one-on-one with individual students. And I would say just one last thing about strengths is not everyone is going to love your strengths, and you're not going to love other people's strengths. I once heard a young woman say, well, I think forgiveness is a weakness, not a strength. And you can hear in that statement that she isn't really going to think you're amazing because you're a forgiving person. But I might think that that's the best possible quality you could have. So a lot of the discussions you can have with your colleagues is just understanding, where do my strengths step on your toes? Where do your strengths step on my toes? Where do we complement one another well? How, if we're working on a group project or a shared mission, can we bring the best of us to the table without having to replicate each other's efforts or stand in each other's way? So again,
that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert. And I think you're right about the profession in education, the tendency to always think about others first. I think that might be something, and I think people who become educators so keen on helping and supporting others. So I hope that message really lands about. I love the way you've put it into steps. Start with myself, then use it with colleagues, those around me. And then when we're comfortable with use of strengths and understanding how they work, working with students. So that's really helpful. One of your great strengths, Robert, is spotting strengths in others. We work together sometimes, and I've seen you do this in a way that's so incisive and insightful and can really land with the person that you're talking to. So can you say a bit more about strength spotting and in others?
Sure. I'll tell you. So first of all, just strength spotting is just looking for strengths in other people. And kind of like how I said, hold these frameworks from positive psychology loosely, I would hold a strength label loosely. We're not interested in pigeonholing people with labels or in demonstrating how correct I, Robert, am. But if I met a student, or if I met one of you, I would kind of be on the prowl mentally. Just, I wonder what's going on. I wonder what the best you is. The first thing that I like about that is that it makes me pretty positively disposed towards you. I'm not looking at, oh, what are your politics? How do you vote? Who are you rude to? There's plenty to divide us. I'm basically looking for, what could I admire in you? What could I see that I could learn from, that I think could be laudable in some way? So I'm just looking for the good in you. And again, not in a Pollyanna way. I recognize that all of us are complex and we all have some, minorly ugly qualities about us, myself included. But I just come in sort of with that mindset. And then I just see where people are really excited and where they seem to excel. Sometimes, in all honesty, I just make up labels for what I'm seeing. But most often I'm using labels that are, kind of commonly understood, like, oh, you're a pretty persuasive person. Oh, you explain things really clearly. You're a great explainer. Oh, you're really funny, right? Strength and humor, whatever it is. And I don't buy into the idea that there are, say, 24 strengths. I think there are hundreds of everyday strengths. And you just have to have a vocabulary for it. So for example, a strength that I think is common among teachers that I don't think is on any of the formal strengths assessment, I call it antenna, like a bug has an antenna. And that is, you're kind of taking the sweep of the entire room, right? You're thinking collectively, are my students getting this? Are they engaged? Are they paying attention? Are they distracted? Who slept well? Who didn't? Who's passing a note? Who's fooling around? Where are the side conversations happening? And I've seen teachers that can be, riding up on the board with their back to the class and they know. And they just turn around and they're like, you two. And I'm just, how do they know this? And I think it's because they have the strength in antenna, which I would describe is being particularly attuned to your attentional periphery and being able to see sort of the whole gestalt, rather than just, every little detail. And it's just wonderful because once you introduce a word like that, now we could all have a conversation about it. Like, who do you know that has antenna? How do they use it effectively? Are there potential downsides to it? Can they be too perceptive and make people feel guarded or self-conscious? Like what would be the right, amount to use that? But I think in just bringing these kind of discussions in, you end up having closer relationships, you're more validating, and you could potentially end up working better together.
How wonderful, Robert. And already I'm excited about the idea of antenna, and I hope our viewers and listeners can, I'm sure they're resonating with it as well. And again, the richness of that in the sense of, I'm just as you said it, I was thinking that strength, like you say, what if it's difficult to switch it off? What if I've got the antennae on all the time? And it's useful in some contexts, and in others, I just want to turn the antennae down a little bit so I can just focus on myself. So it's wonderful. And when I've seen you do this, Robert, you're good at doing that. So I know you're good at the prowling around. You're kind of thinking, what am I going to hone in on? And then you say it. And I think that's really an important part of it, is the verbalizing and acknowledging. But what I notice when you do that, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about what you think is behind this, I notice that it almost like amplifies that strength. So one thing I notice is the person who receives that, it's almost like it boosts that strength to some kind of superpower. And second, I notice that it really builds the relationship, or there's some kind of stronger connection between you and the person to whom you've said, well, I think you're good at this thing.
Yeah. So, I think what's behind it is I'm not showing off, right? I'm not demonstrating how observant I am or how cool I am at strength spotting. I'm really trying to appreciate the person in front of me, and I might not be right about it. So, I've said, like, oh, you seem like a curious person to someone. And they were like, am I? I don't think so. And I was wrong about it. But they didn't walk away from that saying, oh, Robert made a guess about me that was wrong. I mean, they didn't care. Like what they were like, oh, Robert's trying to figure me out. Robert's invested in me. He's paying attention to me. So even sort of a wrong, guess or something that's not in the inner circle of the bullseye often has a pretty kind of ameliorative, beneficial kind of social effect. And then when you do hit, it blows the person wide open. They're just like,
Yeah.
you see me. And I feel so validated in just having been seen.
Yeah.
And it feels good even for me. It feels good to see someone even, which I think is cool.
And it's so cool and so relevant for us in education. As I'm listening to you, my heart is singing, because I just think, wouldn't it be wonderful to have so many more of those interactions, whether that's the teacher being seen by the leader being seen by, somebody more senior, the students being seen. And as you're talking, I'm just thinking, I agree with you. I think antennae is something many educators have already. It's a strength they have. And I was just the idea of directing that antennae to strengths or spotting them, and then taking that next step, which is saying something, which, it's about appreciating. And, I think sometimes we're hesitant, aren't we? We're kind of a bit embarrassed about saying to somebody, oh, I really appreciate how open you are, really. And I love your message about, look, what's the risk? They might say, no, I'm not as open as you think I am, but they still see that you're trying to understand them and connect with them.
Yeah, so let me just say that I've trained this in Australia. I get it. There's tall poppy syndrome there. I understand the humility norms that exist, but I've trained this with educators, Hobart, Perth, Brisbane, Melbourne, Karratha, all over. Yeah. And here's what I found. When you have a discussion about strengths, people are worried that, oh no, people are going to think that I'm too big for my britches, or, think that I'm superior in some way, or if I label their strengths, they're going to feel uncomfortable. And exactly the opposite is true. People feel more connected, more inspired, more honest, more empowered, just across the board, which I think is wonderful. Like, for me to say to you, like, wow, I'm really struck with how good you are at explaining things. You can take really complicated topics and break them down into simple bite-sized amounts that are easy to digest. That shouldn't drive us apart. Now, the person might, feel slightly embarrassed that you said that, but inside they're going to be like, that was reinforcing to me. That helped to hear. And I loved, Christian, that you just mentioned this just in terms of conversations, because I think this is what we have control over. And I would hold this out to educators everywhere. How much time do you spend whinging, right? Because I know that there's a real temptation to be like, oh, we've got these problems, we got to fix this, we got to put out a fire. That's true of every profession, but I think it's especially true of sometimes embattled teachers. And I think it's fine to have those conversations, but I wouldn't want you to exclusively have those conversations. And it is nice to just lead conversations with, what positive change have you made recently? What have you known? What have you seen that's been really effective recently? What strengths do you have that I might not be aware of that would help me to work with you better? And just kind of reframe the tenor of these conversations so that we have more positive, not exclusively positive, but just a greater ratio of positivity in our conversational focus.
Wonderful. I think, and this is really useful, Robert, because some of these things can be applied now or, tomorrow, today, depending where we are. So a couple of questions have come up. Sarah Jane, who also liked the term antenna, and I do think that's resonating. I'm seeing a few people here resonating with that. Sarah Jane's question is, do you think there are gender and cultural biases in terms of how people respond to strength spotting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I already mentioned tall poppy humility norms in Australia. People in Denmark have something called Jentelaw, which is essentially the same phenomenon. People living in many of the Confucian-based societies in the Pacific Rim have strong humility norms. So yeah, there are a number of ways that we might want to tread softly and understand that sort of this idea of like a chest thumping American might not be the way to lead, and I would never advocate that. That said, that's one of the things that I think is so beautiful about coaching. You can leave the greater societal norms largely outside of the coaching session. You can kind of lean in a conspirational way, right? Give them just a little sotto voce and say, in here, we're going to speak openly and honestly. And I know that when you say something about your strength, you don't think you're superior to anyone, you're not bragging. And you and I have to have that honesty in order to talk about how effective you can be. And don't worry, as soon as we walk back through that door, you're back in Australian society or whatever, and you can continue to be humble. And I often find that even just doing like this, setting the small microcultural norm, it is all it takes. I've done these trainings in Japan, I've done them in Australia, I've done them in Denmark to great success, just laying a tiny bit of groundwork up front.
How wonderful. Thank you. And, I notice sometimes with strength spotting on this point that some people deflect them, don't they? It's, oh, you caught me on a good day, or there are those strategies. So my thinking would be that if we are educators or leaders, one thing we can practice is to accept them when they come. And that's just simply saying thank you, isn't it? Rather than coming up with a way to, and this idea of taking a few more risks and giving people those strengths might make a huge difference. I'm going to change tack a little bit. And by the way, if you do have questions as you're listening, please use the Q&A function. That way we can spot them and address them. Claudia's asked a question here, which is around coaching has been described as a positive psychology amplifier, or sometimes as a positive psychology intervention in its own right. What are your thoughts on this for busy educators who are also finding time to coach, Robert?
That's a good question. I think positive, well, no, I think coaching, it just is a positive endeavor. So I've always been, just personally, it rubs me the wrong way to hear that there's a positive education movement, because I think education just is inherently positive. I don't think, traditional instructors are doing, negative education, and now a bunch of psychologists need to come along and encourage them to do it positively. And I think coaching's the same way. Coaching's just coaching, and it is positive. It's joining with someone, giving them the opportunity to reflect and engage in self-directed learning, giving them support and accountability and occasional challenge so that they can articulate their plans, grow, etc. That is positive. It might not always be 100% effective. The coaching relationship might not be perfect, but it is a positive endeavor. I think it can be informed by positive psychology. And in fact, my coaching certainly is. Most of the positive psychology in my coaching, in all honesty, is invisible to my clients. I never, not once, ever do a so-called positive intervention. I'm not telling my clients, go write down 3 things that you're grateful for, because I think that's prescriptive, it's advice, it's not necessarily coaching. Other coaches do that. I don't find it coach-like or necessary or often even effective. Instead, I'll return to what I said about the frameworks. So let's say I know that there's a piece of research that says when people invest heavily in goals, sometimes they end up feeling really anxious, and sometimes they end up feeling really enthusiastic. But wouldn't it be cool if we knew what the difference between those reactions were? It turns out we do. People who are invested in goals, who are anxious, are focusing on what will happen if they fail at the goal. And people who are enthusiastic are focused on the progress they're making towards the goal. So I know diagnostically, if you will, that when I'm talking to someone about their goal and they're reporting anxiety, I have a strong intuition about what they're focusing on. And there may be an idea that if we can just focus on a wider range of things, not just failing at the goal, but progress towards the goal, we might swap out that distressing anxiety for enthusiasm, which will be linked to perseverance, optimism towards the goal, and so forth. So all of that's just happening in my head. It's invisible. I'm not explaining the framework. I'm not telling my client about the research. I'm not doing anything except for asking coaching questions. And the coaching question you might see me ask when the client is fretting about their goal is, "Oh, I'm sorry that it's bringing up this anxiety. I'm curious, what progress have you made towards this goal?" It just looks like a basic coaching question, but it's coming right out of my knowledge of a specific piece of research. But what that means is knowing frameworks, whether it's PERMA or the continuum of motivation or a values framework or a happiness framework of another type, just knowing those well so that they can guide your questions. So
Yeah,
that's the greatest thing that I recommend in positive
thank you.
psych coaching.
Thank you. And, you were talking about becoming a connoisseur in something. It does sound like these are topics that would be good to be a connoisseur in, especially if we're in the business of bringing out the best in people, knowing some of these theories about what motivates people, the best way of encouraging them, empowering them. Sounds wonderful. So thank you. Now, Dai has noticed that as we started our conversation, we said, look, there's three broad ways. We gave the example of assessment, but what are the other broad ways that positive psychology can impact a profession? And in our case, I do think we're thinking within the education context.
Yeah, so we did two of them. We did assessment and frameworks.
Right.
So Dan's question is, what's the third? Good catch. Someone's got antenna or noticing or some strength around not letting things slide. And I would say it's intervention. And it's funny because this runs counter to what I just said about positive interventions in coaching. Unlike coaching, education is more didactic, it is more instructional, it is more prescriptive. So I think that interventions certainly are a better hand in glove fit in the classroom, right? We're using interventions all the time. I'm gonna assign a paper, or a group project, or even a think, pair, share kind of activity with the idea in mind that this intervention, if you will, is going to lead to better comprehension, greater critical thinking skills, what have you. So I think that educators have, outside of their coaching capacity, a wider range of leeway to use positive psychology interventions. So this could be talking about using strengths. It could be, just mindfulness or focusing. It could be, kind of these classic ones, things around appreciation, gratitude, savoring, but it could be ones that are a little further afield. For example, there's a whole class of emotions called knowledge emotions, and they're emotional states that are centrally concerned with us acquiring new information and knowledge. So things like confusion or interest are emotional states around learning. So anything you could do that would heighten interest, and you already have an intuitive sense of this, is itself going to be an intervention. So a lot of the positive psych interventions are around how can we make people sort of happier, have better well-being. But I think from an educator's perspective, how can we make them more engaged? How can we make them more cooperative? How can we help them savor their successes more? How can we help them be more organized? I think all of those interventions are relevant to education.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you very much for the highlighting this idea of intervention, and because I agree entirely with you about positive education. All education is in itself inherently a positive thing. And, I know we both have great appreciation for educators. I'm going to chuck a couple questions at you from our participants, and then I'm going to change tack a little bit and maybe ask you about your an inspiring teacher in your past, if that's okay. But two questions, both kind of, I think, thought-provoking. One was, how does critical feedback, Ruth had asked this question, how does critical feedback fit in, especially when it's tricky to find something positive to say? Ruth is so maybe giving critical feedback, let's say to a colleague. How can we take a positive psychology perspective on that?
I mean, that's a tricky question, right? If I had just the easy answer for you, we would all have long since been doing whatever it is. I think it's important to think about what the feedback is for, right? I think sometimes we notice that a colleague is disorganized or runs late or interrupts us a lot, or whatever this, kind of irritating habit is that creates a little bit of tension on the team. But if I just say, hey, Christian, I noticed that you interrupt all the time. I mean, what's that going to help, right? It's going to make him feel defensive. So it's sort of like, what is it that I want, right? What is this in the service of? And I think about this when, for example, in training coaches, right? You sometimes have to say something that amounts to, well, that wasn't very good, but you want to say it in a way that's much more encouraging than that. And it's not just, well, let me identify one good thing and then tell you the thing I really want to tell you, which is how awful you are. I mean, I think it's, what is my goal here? With this particular person, it's just to build them up because they're at the very beginning of their coaching. Or with someone else, they're about to go for certification, and I actually need to be super honest with them so that they make this change, so that they can, pass a test or whatever it is. And I'm just going to be really clear with myself about that, and then think, how would they most want to hear this in a way that they would be receptive to it? And I think about that for myself. How would I be receptive to this? What would help me avoid feeling defensive about it? So it's not necessarily just like whitewashing everything or, like happy washing everything. I'm definitely not a big believer in like it should all be happiness and positivity. And I think there is room for being critical, but there's not room for being a jerk.
Yeah, that's great. And, I like the focus on reminding ourselves of that intention. The intention is to be helpful by providing information that may be useful for them to achieve something that's important. So I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about it. Any thoughts on how we work with parents who can sometimes impose their desired passion for their child to pursue, but those at school coaching the students see a different reality? So how do we balance that example? Any thoughts there? I've got some quite challenging questions for you, Robert.
I know, that's a really challenging. I mean, this is one of the places that, like, my heart really goes out to educators, because, nominally your charge is to teach a student at a desk in a classroom, but really you're dealing with, the whole school system, all the policies, you're dealing with the parents. Sometimes those parents are very supportive, not always. Whew. So it's tough, right? It's sort of like, my guess is when you went into education, you weren't like, I can't wait to run interference with parents. That's really what calls me to this profession. I mean, it's tough. I mean, I think, when you're doing your parent-teacher conferences, you have an opportunity to talk up the child, to really report on what you see, what their interests are, what their strengths are. And then ultimately, I think you have to have the humble grasp on the child to allow the parent to be the parent, even if that's different.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So we're getting quite a few questions on here, and my hope was to switch to asking you about your an inspiring teacher in your past. So I just want to acknowledge John's comment. John says relationships are fundamental for effective learning interactions, and I think you know, we would both agree with that sentiment. And Mia says, how do we communicate with leaders who think positive psychology and positive education is just fluff and not the important thing we need to focus on? I thought that was a useful question. And then I'll be switching to just asking you about your an inspiring educator.
Sure. So it's Mia, it's a great question. Here's the things I find that have traction. Number one, look, I'm not here to convert you to this. That's not my role. I'm going to lay out a case and you can take it or not. You're an adult, but you know, I would like it if people would give positive psych a fair shake, but you know, I'm not a tent revival preacher trying to convert people. It's just not what I'm doing. Second, I think people respond well if you show positive psych in its nuance. So if I tell people, I take a strengths-based approach, but I also love working on weaknesses with people. People sit up and take more note of that than they do than I just look at strengths in people, or I just look at happiness in people. I'm like, oh no, I think data are pretty clear. People experience about 70% pretty positive emotion, maybe not intense, but you know, at least mildly positive. But in any given day, across a week, about 30% not so positive emotion. And I'm not looking to change that. I think that's just helpful to know. And I think that the leaders in my experience have really responded well to that. Like, oh, this isn't just going to be happyology. There's going to be some nuance to it. And then you can just give them the research. Do you know that people who are an 8 on satisfaction outperform other students? That is, their grade point averages are higher than less satisfied students. Do you know that people who are 18 who are more satisfied 20 years later go on to make a significantly higher income? Do you know that people who experience a reasonable amount of positive emotion during the day have better immune systems, take fewer sick days, volunteer more, donate more to charity, fall off ladders less, go to the emergency room less, smoke fewer cigarettes, drink alcohol less? I mean, we have really good data on health, income, and academic achievement, linking it to some form of positivity. So if that's enough to get you to sit up and take notice, I think give it a shot.
Thank you, Robert. And it just sounds like such a respectful way. So thank you, Mia, for that question. Citing some of the research. And as Robert said, there's a lot of this content online that we can find. I mean, for example, the World Happiness Report, that's got so much data in it about the importance of satisfaction with life, or high levels of subjective well-being. So it's a lot of resources out there. And thank you so much, Robert, for everything you've shared. Incisive intellect was one of the things that a strength I know in you, and it was obvious today. And generosity, taking the time, sharing these insights. And, I've asked you to speak at other things I've hosted, and the feedback is always, one of the words is wow. And I think that's what people are taking away from today is, wow, so thought-provoking and so immediately applicable. And it's just my curiosity, and we've got, maybe about 8 minutes left. And, I know we're both passionate about education, and it's something that I think about all the time. And I really appreciate all the educators and leaders who are listening to this. It's, so my question to you is, can you tell us about a teacher who really inspired you?
Absolutely. I always hated school. Let me just say that right up front. And that does not mean that I hated teachers or learning. I have always loved learning my entire life, but hated school. And I'm sure you recognize this in many of your own students. I didn't like grades. I didn't like tests. I didn't like homework. I didn't like some of the kind of the policies and some of, frankly, the work that what felt to me like the jumping through hoops that went with education. But I was completely wrapped with attention about the topics. I was paying attention every day. I was learning. I was eager to engage in discussion, to do big, projects or write papers. And as a result, I did very poorly in school. Um, I sometimes was suspended from school. I was expelled from 2 schools. I failed classes. I did very, very poorly. And so the teachers that stand out to me, Judy Nolan, Kim Hallbeck, Terry Kazat, and these are from, decades and decades ago. These are people who went to bat for me, who said, I just see you, Robert. I see your potential and I see that you're paying attention. I also see that you're failing. And yet, I think you know as much about this topic as any other student in here. And I want you to know that I know that, and that that's not good enough. That it's not good enough for you to have all this knowledge and not do well and fail. So what I want to do is take a little extra time to support you. What is it I can do with you? Can we do an independent study? Can we give you an extra paper to write? Because that seems to be where you're doubling down. What can we do to make sure that you can go to a good college or whatever? And I am deeply appreciative to this day for them not letting me off the hook, kind of in a very caring and compassionate way. But more than anything, what I think they were willing to do is not treat me like a behavior problem or like a disengaged student. What they were willing to do is really see me for who I am and how engaged I was and how much I was learning.
Wow, that's moving, and I really appreciate you sharing that. I only mentioned I was going to ask you this question pretty recently, so it's amazing that the names of those teachers come top of mind. And, Nancy Reynolds for me, Donald Corsett, Jean-Marie Cook, George Geralla, these people really stand out, don't they? That these are the ones that did exactly what you said. And, I really appreciate the conversation we've had. And I really appreciate, as I said, all of the educators on there. I know that the educators, you're going to be those named people as well. And I think some of the things we've talked about, Robert and I talked about, definitely helpful for that. There's things we can do immediately, some of the ideas of acknowledging our strengths, spotting strengths in others. Thank you so much, Robert. As I said, another example of how you're a wonderful teacher to me. You'd be one of those named, Robert. And also it's just been one of those conversations that I've just so enjoyed and learned so much from. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. On behalf of our colleagues at Growth Coaching International, and on behalf of all of those who have attended live and attending the recording, we're very grateful to you. Thank you so much, Robert.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all of you who are spending your time with us. Thanks.